Hey guys, Editing Gabby here. Unfortunately, I realized while I was going to edit this video that the intro I had originally filmed did not get recorded somehow. I think that I basically misclicked the button on my camera and it didn't record, and it just was a hot mess. I was already having a struggling day the day that I was filming this video, so just so you guys know, this is basically a Halloween reading recommendation. I split it up into three categories where I have more of a horror-based kind of Halloween-y story, stuff that would be perfect if you're a big horror movie fan, mystery thriller with a little bit of a dark academia, maybe almost kind of spin to it, and then also more supernatural, paranormal fantasies that involve things like monsters, like vampires and magic and stuff like that. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the recommendation.
Without further ado, let's start off with a bang and get into the horror books that I would highly recommend in this time. Now, mind you, in the past, my go-to would usually be Stephen King, right? We all know that I was a huge Stephen King fan. Up until like about halfway through this year, I finally decided to stop reading his books. I just didn't find them as enjoyable as I had originally thought the idea of reading all of his books was going to be. So I don't have any Stephen King books to recommend you guys because I don't want to recommend his stuff on my channel anymore. I don't think that he is as good of an author as he used to be. I'm very tired of reading his books and being disappointed by them. I also want to promote other authors that are doing just as great of a job as he is and basically try to stop comparing too many books to his, because of the fact that there are some books like The Weight of Blood by Tiffany D. Jackson that are direct retellings of his stories, but these books that I'm going to be mentioning are not in any way Stephen King related. I have a few books here, but the first one I want to talk about is The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. I know that this book gets really popular around this time of year, and it rightly deserves that because it not only is a book that is written by an Indigenous author, it is also a story that takes place on a reservation and deals with four Native men as they are basically being haunted by what they believe to be as the spirit of this animal that they had accidentally killed. It's very early on in the book you learn about that, so that's not really a spoiler, but they're wondering what is really the root cause of their hauntings, and you follow each of the four men as they go through their own daily lives and see these really creepy, mysterious things happening. It's very gory at some parts. It is very much a story that is about a haunting, so go into this with that mindset, but this is very great. The atmosphere in here is what I really enjoy the most about Stephen Graham Jones's writing. It's the fact that he was able to not only just write a really well done horror story, but the atmosphere was the most suffocating one I have found in a very long time. So I highly recommend this one for those of you that especially want to read things by Indigenous authors. Next is Extasia by Claire Legrand. Now, many of you may know I read this here a couple months ago and I absolutely loved it. This was one of my most anticipated reads for the year 2022 and was a 5 out of 5 stars for me. Now, the reason that I picked this one, although it is a little chunky, I did find myself flying through this book very quickly. It was very action-packed. It was something that I think, although the size can be a little intimidating for some people, kind of once you get into the story, you kind of can't stop. This follows a young woman in a neo-puritanical society. Think like The Village or Handmaid's Tale kind of idea. And in this world, there are four young girls when they reach of age that are picked to be the saints of the town. They are basically physical embodiments of the saints of this town that was first built upon. And this is also post-apocalyptical. You learn that there were things that had happened in the past that led to things happening now. Our main character, Amity, goes through the process of becoming a saint, and in the course of that finds out that there's a lot more outside of the wall of her society, and she's kind of entranced by it and wants to know more. And in the course of this, she's also trying to save her family's name because of the fact that her mother, you learn, was outcasted from the entire community, and there's some really mysterious things that are going on in terms of what's really happening in this society. It definitely has Village vibes. I've said that multiple times in reference to this book. If you like The Village, this is a very similar setup and a very similar idea of a character that has to go outside the wall for a very specific purpose kind of thing. If you're into those vibes, I would highly recommend this. It's not necessarily completely horror until the later portions of the book, but there is a lot of death that is involved in this world, so go into it knowing that it's probably going to be a while before you start seeing any actual horrific elements, because For the most part, this is really playing on the witchy vibes, the really kind of weird atmosphere and tension that there is within the village itself. Now, I have two series that actually are by the same author that I would highly recommend because I have really found to enjoy these despite how cheesy they may be. And that is the Haunted and Unleashed series by Daniel Vega, as well as the Merciless series. Now, at this point where I am in my reading, I just read the Merciless 3 and will be reading the fourth and final book in the series here really soon by the end of the month. Now, this though is an author that I found back when I was in like early college, late high school kind of time. And these definitely are more of the horrific elements that I would like to see in horror. However, in the Merciless, it is really playing into this kind of exorcist kind of idea, and the Haunted kind of does, except it's more of a haunted house idea. So you've got two different kinds of stories in terms of horror going on. I will say that the Haunted is a duology. There are two books, and again, both series are very cheesy. They do play on some really kind of cheesy stereotypes when it comes to horror, but if you're into that kind of thing, if you like kind of just fast-paced, kind of light, not necessarily light-hearted, but cheesier kinds of stories, and definitely would pick these up. I will say that the further the story goes into the Merciless, the more terrifying it becomes. It does, into some ways, become kind of a torture porn kind of idea. I still do recommend purely because the horrific elements that are played into this story in particular are terrifying. But if you're not a fan of exorcism, do not read this book, because I know there are a lot of people who are really iffy with possession and exorcisms. Those play very highly into this series, so be aware of that going in. In terms of the Haunted, though, this is pretty much just a haunted house story, but it does involve some very traumatic things that have happened to characters. It is not for the faint of heart, I would say, in terms of some of the trigger warnings that are associated with this, so please do your research on this series in particular because of that, but it is very fun. I read through the two books within the span of a few days because they're really short, and they're fast-paced and they're fun to fly through, so definitely would recommend if you at least want to be really kind of terrified and maybe kind of put off center for a little bit. Now, one book I really want to make sure I talk about in this video too is an ebook. So I don't have the physical copy of this, but it is my ebook copy of The Weight of Blood by Tiffany D. Jackson. Now, I stated before that I was a girly that was really into Stephen King, and this book is a direct retelling of Carrie. However, this plays on a lot more elements than I think Carrie had even been exposed to, because this in particular deals with things about racism that I think are incredibly important to bring up in today's society. This is a story about a young girl who has been passing as white for a very long time because her white father has been basically brainwashing her into thinking that a black person is not a good person, all these things. And it turns out that the school finds out about the fact that she's black, and she becomes excessively bullied for it. And in retaliation of that, there are some people in the school who want to have their first racially integrated prom, which apparently in this school had not existed at this point. At this point in time, the school had it where they had an all-black prom and an all-white prom. And they realized that with the rise in social media and the attention that the school was getting for their very backwards racist ideas, that this idea would probably be in their best interest. Even though in my opinion it's kind of too little too late, but this story does follow our main character as well as a couple other characters. Similar to Carrie, it is kind of a looking at how things had been perceived in the media and things like that following the events of the prom itself. In this one, we have a podcast for true crime that basically brings up the case of Maddie Washington, and they're trying to piece together what actually did happen because there's a lot of unanswered questions, there's a lot of things that people don't really know about, and over the course of the story, you get interviews with people, you get people talking about the pyrokinetic, telekinetic things that are brought up within this story, similar to what was brought up within Carrie. So I do recommend this one way, way more than Carrie. I think that this blew Carrie completely out of the water, and I highly recommend you read this over the original because I think this one, honestly, is the best version. The original version of Carrie is, while it is the most prominent Stephen King book because it was his first published book, it does have a lot of problems with it because of the fact it was published in the 1970s. And I honestly just feel like a lot of the elements that were brought up in Carrie were not really well explored. Whereas in The Weight of Blood, I think that they were definitely more explored, as well as, obviously, like I said, fleshing out an entirely new story by bringing in a whole new element that was never brought up in Carrie, which was a factor of racism and what would happen if somebody who was found out to be black but white passing was a thing. Like, what would happen if that was brought up, and especially a Southern school that is pretty notorious for mistreatment of black students. So I just really highly recommend this one, and I would talk about it for days, but I'm going to shut up about it right now. Okay, so we're going to move on to more mystery thriller books that are also in some ways maybe going into dark academia. I have 3 options right now that I think would best fit this, and 2 of them are by the same author, and they are classics because I do think that this author is a very well-established author in the mystery thriller area, and they're just really quick to fly through and very interesting even to this day, and that is Agatha Christie. Now, the 2 I'm going to recommend to you are And Then There Were None, as well as Halloween Party, which Halloween Party is a Hercule Poirot mystery, and it actually takes place over the course of a Halloween party. Now, this one you don't necessarily have to have read the other Hercule Poirot books in the past to get to this one. This is kind of one of those like weird standalone, like, most of the Hercule Poirot stories are standalones, like they all just take over the space of different cases, but this one I read in college because we read it for a particular class, and it was around Halloween time when we read it, and it was a really fun time. I really liked this a lot, and again, just it's a very fast book to fly through. And Then There Were None, though, is one of Agatha Christie's most popular stories of all time. This is a true standalone where it basically is done and over with after this book. There is no sequel to this. There's no other stories that are tying into this. And this takes place over the course of this night where there are a lot of people brought to this island. I think like 10 people. It's on the song 10 Little Indians, which I don't know whether or not that necessarily was right of her to kind of reference it. I don't know whether or not it's offensive to include that in the story. I'd have to do my research on that. But the song 10 Little Indians basically talking about how, you know, like, think of like monkeys on the bed kind of idea. You know, one fall off and bumped his head, that kind of thing. This story is basically the whittling down of these 10 people that go to this island for a party, and nobody really knows why they're all brought together. None of them seem to know each other. They don't really seem to have much in common. And slowly but surely, they are whittled down to the very last, and it's a mystery of figuring out who is killing these people and what is the motive. And I will say that when I first read this, this was something I was blown out of the water with. I did not guess who the culprit was. I don't think many people really, when they read this, know offhand who the culprit is. And so for a lot of people, the reason why they love this is that they don't feel like they ever really kind of got the answer right away. So I always recommend this one around this time frame because it's creepy, it's atmospheric, and it's a heart jerker because you don't know who's gonna survive the night. You don't know who's behind everything until the very, very end. And I think y'all will be shocked when you read this one because I was massively. Now, my other book that I want to recommend that is more of a mystery thriller because it has mystery thriller elements but also does play on dark academia is The Maidens by Alex Michaelides. Now, this technically is a companion novel to Alex's other book, The Silent Patient. It does deal with a character who has a connection to the main character in The Silent Patient, but it is a standalone in its own right. It is its own mystery. This basically follows the story of a woman who unfortunately loses her husband, and when she goes to visit her niece, she finds out that one of her niece's classmates has been murdered, and all eyes are on this very prestigious group called the Maidens, and specifically the head of that, who is a professor. There's a lot of thought that maybe the professor has been sleeping around with students, that something has happened and that he has started to kill some of the young girls on this campus, but nobody really knows for sure. And so the main character basically gets herself involved in that case and trying to figure out what happened to her niece's classmate while also dealing with her own grief of losing her husband and a lot of the mystery surrounding around what really happened to her husband. Find out that he may have been having an affair with somebody, but you really don't know. And there, throughout this are little notes that you don't really know who they're from. They may have something to do with the case, they may not. So we really don't know what's going on. And I really enjoyed this. I definitely think it doesn't necessarily have all of the Dark Academia vibes that people are looking for with this. I know that that was one big complaint from a lot of people when they read this earlier this year. But I do think that in terms of the mystery thriller aspect and really questioning what was going on, it was really fun. I did like it. I do think that it was something that could be read in an entire day. I will say that the overall ending was bizarre, and I still to this day don't really know if I could fully wrap my head around what happened. But it was kind of something where I was caught off guard, and I was okay with being caught off guard by it. So I would recommend that, but I know that this is kind of hit or miss for a lot of people, but I enjoyed it. So I guess take what I say with a grain of salt. Okay, finally we are going to go into some more kind of paranormal supernatural stories with some very big favorites of mine. The first of which being my most favorite vampire story of all time, which is the Morganville Vampire series by Rachel Caine. Now, y'all know I have talked about this series many times. I actually need to go back through and fix my page flags for both of these books because I hate these so much, and I just need to find the time to actually go back and fix them. But the Morganville Vampires, the first book starting off with Glass Houses, is a kind of like younger YA paranormal story where our main character named Claire ends up being able to go to college early at the age of 16, and she goes to the town of Morganville to go to a more local college that's closer to home and finds out that the entire town is run by vampires. And she ends up having to move into the house of these 3 like college-age students because she basically is bullied out of her dormitory and ends up finding out through them about the town and going through some really kind of traumatic things for a 16-year-old girl. I highly recommend it. It is very fast to fly through. The first like 10 books in this series are like 250 pages and less, and then you get to like some of the later books in the series and then they're kind of more full-fledged novels. Really enjoy this. This is one of my most favorite vampire series of all time, and it's a little cheesy here and there. It's kind of that younger YA like 2000s, 2010s vampire story, but very fun. Always a good time reading it. Very much a warm and fuzzy kind of story for me, so highly recommend. Another author where I have 2 books to recommend because of the fact that I think that they in 2 different ways have vibes that I think people are going to really like, and that is Shea Ernshaw. Now, one of which being her newest release, which is The Nightmare Before Christmas story that just came out here in August. This is following Sally's story. This is the direct sequel to the story of The Nightmare Before Christmas movie. I read this recently and I absolutely loved it. The atmosphere and the characterization of Sally was so well done. I think a lot of Nightmare Before Christmas fans are going to enjoy this immensely because of the fact that it feels so ingrained in the story of The Nightmare Before Christmas. But this follows Sally, where she basically is not sure if she's really ready to become the Pumpkin Queen, and she goes and runs away for a hot minute and accidentally opens this door to a brand new world she's never been to before, never heard of, and it lets loose this monster basically that is ravaging all of the other worlds, and it's up to her to then right that mistake that she made and save everybody. And there's even some things that you learn about Sally that we never really learned about in the original movie that I found to be very interesting. It's so quick to fly through. I read almost the entirety of this in one day, I kid you not, in almost one sitting. And it was just really fun, and again, I think it's perfect for this time of year, especially for my Nightmare Before Christmas fans, because it just has all of those warm, cozy vibes from the movie, and I think that this was such a well-done sequel, and I was genuinely surprised by that because I was worried that this was not going to live up to the original, and I think that this honestly did a really good job, and I was very happy to see that. Now, Shea's other book I would highly recommend is the only other book I have read by her. I currently have her other book, Winterwood, but I've not read that as of yet. But I have read The Wicked Deep by her, and I liked this. I think at the time I gave it like a 3-star or maybe a 4-star. However, in terms of the overall atmosphere and the vibes of this, I think people are going to love it. And I know that a lot of people who have read this in the past have said that that's been the most fun part of this book, while not necessarily the mystery thriller aspect of it that's going on, but the vibes were immaculate. Now, this takes place in a town where every so often there are a ton of boys that go missing. I think it's like every June, basically. And there are so many that get taken into the sea and drowned. Because supposedly there was a thing that happened hundreds of years before where there were 3 women who were accused of being witches that were burned at the stake, and they placed a curse on this town. And our main character basically finds out about that curse, and she's fairly new to the town, and she's looking to basically stop it. She's looking for some way to end the curse once and for all, to keep more boys from going and being killed, basically. So definitely think that this is not something that's going to be for everybody. I think that one of the main complaints with this when it first came out was that it didn't feel as tightened up and as cohesive as people would like it to be. It definitely has that YA vibe. It's meant more for a younger audience. So go into it with that mindset, but it does have very great Halloween vibes that I think a lot of people are going to enjoy for this time. And now the final book I'm going to recommend is something that I'm actually kind of surprised I'm going to recommend it, purely because I think it has a lot to do with nostalgia, but also because by itself I think I gave the book too hard of a time when I first read it. And that's Practical Magic by Alice Hoffman. Now, this, obviously, the movie is like a fan favorite for everybody. So I'm going to say, if you're a fan of the movie and have not read the book and want to read the book, please, please, please keep in mind, this is so very different from the movie. Now, there are some lines that are taken directly from the book that were put into the movie. There are some things that were directly in the book that were put into the movie. This, I think, though, focuses more on Sally's daughters, Antonia and Kylie, than it does actually Sally and Jilly. And the sequel to this is directly affected with Antonia and Kylie. And it does have a lot to do with Sally and Jillian as well. But again, it's focused more on the daughters. I think that when it comes to this book, people are going to be really disappointed. I was initially, because I was such a huge fan of the movie, that I was so disappointed when reading this that this was nothing in a lot of ways like the movie. There are definitely some things that I was like, oh yeah, I totally see where they got that, but ultimately the movie is, in my opinion, the better of the two. But I do think I was comparing this too much to the movie when I first had read it. The vibes are great. You know, it's perfect for that Halloween time, especially if you're a fan of the movie. It's got a lot of witchy aspects to it. But really, this is a story about family. This is a story about a family of witches and them trying to basically survive in a world where they have this curse placed upon them from their ancestors, and they're trying to like live day by day, not just as normal people, but as a cohesive unit. Because you learn that Sally is really, really depressed, and she's having a hard time with connecting to many people, and you find that Jillian is obviously, you know, having her own issues as well. Like the whole thing with Jimmy from the movie, that is involved in this very briefly. And the daughters, though, Antonia and Kylie, they're kind of trying to, like, figure themselves out. They're trying to figure out, you know, what to do about the fact that they may have magic in their blood from their family line, but they don't really know much about it because Sally doesn't really tell them much about it. And, like, there's just a lot to do with, I think, grief and loss and trying to find your way again after those things, and about family and the struggles that some families can have in a very dysfunctional setting, in terms of like how Sally and Jillian are, and then how that affects Antonia and Kylie. So yeah, it's a really good story, I think, by itself, but compared to the movie was just not what I was expecting, and I think that I really kind of judged it a little too harshly because of that. So I think if you're gonna read this, though, if you're a fan of the movie, go into it knowing that there's only so much that they pulled from this for the movie and really extrapolated on aspects that were never really a part of the book in the first place. Like, they extrapolated so much more on the story with Jimmy and the story with Sally and the detective. Like, all of that is not, like, really played into here at all. And it's important that you go into it with that mindset, because this is more focusing on the family itself as opposed to the other storylines that are involved. But without further ado, those are all of the books that I am recommending for this Halloween time, as well as The Weight of Blood, because like I said, I don't have a physical copy of it, but I do have the ebook copy. So like I said, let me know what you guys would recommend in this time for everyone who's looking for Halloween spooky reads, whether it's witchy, monsters, or even just mystery thrillers. I would love to know, and I'm sure there are plenty of people who would really like that as well, but I definitely think that these are all books you could get done in one day, because they're fast-paced, they're fun, they are really creepy, be in some capacity, and they definitely are just huge page turners, which I think are the most important when it comes to reading something in an entire day. But thank you all so much for joining me today. If you guys did enjoy this video, please do give it a big thumbs up. And if you haven't already and you'd like to be and would like to see more content like this, go ahead and hit that button down below and subscribe to become an owlet in our flock. And I will see all of you guys in my next video. Bye, guys.